Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what happened in the past 48 hours represents one of the most significant diplomatic reversals in modern American foreign policy. Trump issued what he called his final ultimatum to Iran. Cease all uranium enrichment above 5%, dismantle your ballistic missile program, or face maximum economic and military pressure. That ultimatum was delivered through Swiss diplomatic channels on Monday morning. By Wednesday evening, Iran had responded, and that response did not just reject Trump's demands. It exposed the complete collapse of American leverage in the region. I am looking at the official statement released by Iran's Supreme National Security Council. It is 3 pages long. It does not plead. It does not negotiate. It does not offer compromise. What it does is systematically dismantle every premise of Trump's ultimatum and then issue counter-demands that demonstrate Tehran understands Washington's position better than Washington understands its own. The document concludes with a paragraph that should terrify anyone in the State Department who still believes American threats carry weight. And I quote directly, "The Islamic Republic has endured 45 years of American hostility and emerged stronger with every passing decade. We do not fear your sanctions. We do not fear your military. We fear only God and answer only to our people." In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why Trump's ultimatum failed before it was even delivered, why Iran's response reveals a strategic confidence that comes from holding every important card in this confrontation, and why what happens next will determine whether American influence in the Middle East survives this decade. This is analysis you will not hear from establishment media because it requires acknowledging that American power is far more limited than political leaders are willing to admit publicly. Let's start with the ultimatum itself and why it was doomed from the moment it was conceived. Trump demanded 3 things. First, cessation of uranium enrichment above 5% purity. Second, full dismantlement of Iran's ballistic missile program. Third, termination of support for proxy groups across the region. In exchange, Trump offered to consider limited sanctions relief and a possible return to negotiations. On its face, this sounds like hardball diplomacy. In reality, it is fantasy. Here is why. Iran's nuclear program, its missile development, and its regional alliances are the 3 pillars of its national security strategy. They are not bargaining chips. They are existential requirements for a country that has been targeted for regime change by the United States for 4 decades. Think about what Trump is actually asking. He wants Iran to voluntarily eliminate its ability to deter American or Israeli military action, dismantle its most effective means of projecting regional influence, and trust that the United States will reward this strategic surrender with limited and reversible sanctions relief. From Tehran's perspective, this is not a negotiation. This is a demand for capitulation. And the history of how the United States treated Libya after Gaddafi gave up his weapons program is fresh in every Iranian policymaker's mind. According to reporting by the Washington Post and confirmed by multiple European diplomatic sources, the Trump administration did not consult with European allies before issuing the ultimatum. Britain, France, and Germany, all of whom are trying to salvage some version of the Iran nuclear deal, were blindsided by Trump's move. That matters because it means Iran knows the ultimatum represents Trump's position, not a unified Western position. And Iran has spent years building economic and diplomatic relationships with European countries, Russia, and China specifically to create divisions between America and its traditional allies. Subscribe if you are starting to understand that the power dynamics in this relationship are not what you have been told. Now let's look at how Iran responded and what that response reveals. Announcement number 1, Iran called Trump's bluff, and in doing so, exposed that the threats backing the ultimatum are hollow. The Iranian response begins by noting that the United States is currently applying maximum pressure sanctions that are, according to American officials, the toughest sanctions ever imposed on any country. So the threat of additional economic pressure is meaningless. What more can Trump do? He is already blocking Iranian oil exports, freezing assets, sanctioning any company that does business with Iran. The economic pressure is already at maximum. There is no escalation available. On the military front, Iran's response is even more pointed. The document notes that American military forces in the region are within range of Iranian missiles and drones. American bases in Iraq, Syria, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE are all vulnerable. Any American attack on Iranian territory would trigger immediate retaliation against those bases and against American allies in the region. The question Iran poses is simple. Is Trump willing to accept hundreds of American casualties and a regional war to enforce an ultimatum that Iran has already rejected? The answer, based on Trump's actual behavior over 5 years, is no. Trump pulled back from airstrikes against Iran in 2019 after being told they would kill approximately 150 Iranians. He chose not to respond militarily when Iran shot down an American drone worth $130 million. He chose not to escalate after Iranian proxy forces attacked Saudi oil facilities, temporarily taking 5% of global oil supply offline. At every decision point where Trump had the option to use military force against Iran, he chose not to. Iran has studied this pattern, and they are betting that it continues. According to analysis from the International Crisis Group, Iran's leadership believes that Trump's foreign policy is driven primarily by his desire to avoid new military entanglements that could hurt his political standing domestically. They believe he talks tough but backs down when confronted with the real costs of military action. And their response to his ultimatum is designed to test that assessment. They are forcing Trump to either escalate militarily, which they believe he will not do, or back down, which would humiliate him and demonstrate to the entire region that American threats are empty. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2. Iran did not just reject Trump's demands. Iran issued its own list of demands. This is a power move that reveals how dramatically the balance has shifted. Iran's counter-demands include the following. First, immediate lifting of all unilateral American sanctions, which Iran argues violate international law and the spirit of the original nuclear agreement that Trump withdrew from. Second, compensation for economic damage caused by sanctions, which Iran estimates at over $1 trillion in lost oil revenue and frozen assets. Third, formal American recognition of Iran's right to maintain defensive military capabilities, including ballistic missiles. Fourth, American withdrawal from military bases in Iraq and Syria that Iran argues constitute illegal occupation. Now, obviously, the United States is not going to agree to any of these demands. That is not the point. The point is that Iran is framing the negotiation as one between equals, not as a situation where America dictates terms and Iran must choose between compliance and punishment. Iran is saying, if you want to negotiate, we can negotiate, but we will be negotiating our demands as well as yours. And if you are not willing to compromise, then there is nothing to discuss. Stay with me, because this is where you see the complete inversion of the power relationship that existed even 5 years ago. In 2015, when the original nuclear deal was negotiated, Iran came to the table from a position of significant economic pressure. Sanctions had reduced oil exports from 2.5 million barrels per day to under 1 million. The rial had lost half its value. Inflation was running above 30%. Iran needed sanctions relief badly enough that it was willing to accept extensive limitations on its nuclear program in exchange. Today, the situation is fundamentally different. Iran has adapted to sanctions. It has built smuggling networks that allow it to export oil to China despite American pressure. It has developed a domestic industrial base that produces many of the goods it previously imported. It has strengthened relationships with Russia and China that provide economic lifelines the United States cannot cut. Most importantly, Iran has learned that American sanctions, while painful, are not fatal, and that survival means maintaining strategic capabilities even at significant economic cost. According to data from the International Monetary Fund, Iran's economy has stabilized despite sanctions. GDP growth turned positive in 2024. Inflation has been brought under control. Unemployment remains high but is not spiraling. This is not prosperity. This is survival. But survival is enough to sustain resistance, and resistance is what Iran's entire strategic posture is built on. Iran's response to Trump includes a sentence that should be required reading for every American policymaker. We have endured decades of sanctions, sabotage, and threats. We remain standing. You withdrew from an agreement that was working and demanded our surrender. We do not surrender. If you wish to negotiate seriously, we are willing. If you wish to issue ultimatums, we will ignore them. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this is what changes everything. Europe, Russia, and China all sided with Iran against the ultimatum. Not publicly, not in dramatic statements, but in quiet diplomatic communications that make clear they view Trump's approach as counterproductive and will not support it. Within 24 hours of Iran's response being delivered, the European Union's foreign policy chief issued a statement calling for de-escalation and renewed dialogue. That his diplomatic language for Trump's ultimatum was a mistake, and we are not backing it. France's foreign minister followed with a statement emphasizing that Europe remains committed to preserving the nuclear agreement and encouraging all parties to avoid actions that increase tensions. Russia was more direct. The Russian Foreign Ministry released a statement saying that unilateral ultimatums and threats are not a basis for serious diplomacy and calling on the United States to return to the negotiating framework established by the original agreement. China's position was conveyed through back channels, but the message was the same. Beijing will not support American pressure on Iran and will continue economic engagement regardless of US sanctions. Think carefully about what this represents. When Trump issued his ultimatum, he expected it to be backed by a unified international front that would force Iran to choose between compliance and complete isolation. Instead, Iran rejected the ultimatum, and the international community largely supported Iran's position. America's closest allies publicly distanced themselves from Trump's approach. America's strategic competitors explicitly sided with Iran. This is a geopolitical defeat, not a military defeat. Not an economic defeat. A diplomatic defeat that exposes how limited American ability to shape outcomes has become when other major powers choose not to cooperate. According to reporting by Reuters, Trump administration officials have privately expressed frustration that European allies are not supporting maximum pressure. But frustration is not a policy. The Europeans have made a strategic calculation that maintaining economic and diplomatic relationships with Iran serves their interests better than aligning with American pressure. And there is nothing the United States can do to change that calculation without damaging relationships with Europe that are far more important than the specific issue of Iran. Now, let's talk about what the media is actively avoiding, which is the question of what Trump does next. Because the ultimatum failed. Iran rejected it. The international community did not back it. And Trump now faces a choice between escalation and humiliation. Escalation means military action. But military action against Iran carries risks that Trump has consistently refused to accept. A limited strike would provoke Iranian retaliation without changing Iran's strategic position. A large-scale campaign would require mobilizing hundreds of thousands of troops for an invasion that would make Iraq look minor in comparison. Trump ran on getting America out of Middle East wars, not starting new ones. His political base would revolt if he launched an invasion of Iran. So if military escalation is off the table, what is left? More sanctions. Sanctions are already at maximum. More diplomatic pressure. The diplomatic isolation is being applied to the United States, not to Iran. More threats? Threats that are not backed by action become less credible each time they are issued. The most likely outcome is that Trump quietly drops the ultimatum, declares victory by pointing to continued sanctions, and pretends the whole thing never happened. That is the pattern he has followed repeatedly. Big announcement, tough talk, then silence when the approach fails. The problem is that each iteration of this pattern further erodes American credibility and emboldens adversaries who learn that American threats can be safely ignored. If you are watching American foreign policy and wondering why adversaries seem increasingly willing to challenge American positions, this is why. Not because America lacks military power, but because military power that you are unwilling to use is not power at all. It is expensive decoration. This pattern has played out before, and the historical lesson is always the same. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The Soviets had vastly superior military power. They invaded. They occupied. They tried to impose their will through force. And after a decade of fighting, they withdrew, having achieved none of their objectives and having accelerated their own decline as a superpower. The lesson is not that military power is useless. The lesson is that military power alone cannot force political outcomes when the other side is willing to accept costs that you are not willing to impose. The Soviet Union could have won in Afghanistan by killing or displacing most of the population, but that would have been genocide, and even the Soviets were not willing to go that far. So they settled for a grinding war of attrition that they could not win and eventually abandoned. The United States faces the same dynamic with Iran. America could destroy Iran militarily, but doing so would require levels of death and destruction that American society and the international community would not accept. Short of that, what options remain? Economic pressure that Iran has learned to survive. Diplomatic isolation that the international community will not enforce. Military threats that everybody knows will not be carried out. Iran understands this. That is why they rejected the ultimatum with confidence. That is why their response was not fearful or pleading, but assertive and defiant. They know the limits of American power better than Trump does. So where does this leave us? 3 scenarios, and only one of them ends without significant American humiliation. Path 1. Trump quietly abandons the ultimatum approach and returns to some form of negotiation, possibly using European or regional intermediaries to save face. This would be the smart move strategically, but it requires Trump to admit that his maximum pressure approach failed. Given his personality, this is unlikely unless domestic political calculations force his hand. Path 2. The status quo continues with escalating rhetoric, but no actual change in policy. Sanctions remain. Iran continues its nuclear program. Regional tensions stay high. This is the path of least resistance, but also the most dangerous, because it guarantees repeated crises with increasing risk of accidental escalation. Path 3. Trump attempts a limited military strike to show resolve, Iran retaliates, and the situation escalates into a regional conflict that neither side wanted, but both are now trapped in. This is the nightmare scenario, and while still unlikely, it becomes more probable with each failed diplomatic initiative. I believe we are currently on Path 2, but the window for Path 1 is closing rapidly. Every day that passes with Trump's ultimatum lying rejected makes it harder for him to reverse course without looking weak. But continuing down Path 2 increases the odds of eventually sliding into Path 3 through miscalculation or desperation. Here are the questions you need to ask. First, do you trust that political leaders in Washington understand the limits of American power and will adjust policy accordingly? Second, if they do not understand those limits, what happens when reality forces that understanding on them during a crisis? Third, how much economic and political cost are you personally willing to absorb for a Middle East policy that is demonstrably failing to achieve its stated objectives? Tell me in the comments whether you think Trump will back down, double down, or find some face-saving middle path. Tell me whether you believe American threats still carry weight in international relations, or whether adversaries have learned they can be safely ignored. We will keep tracking every statement, every move, every signal from Washington and Tehran. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with anyone who needs to understand that what is playing out between the United States and Iran is not just about nuclear weapons or regional influence. It is about whether American power remains credible in the 21st century. Turn on notifications, because what happens in the next few weeks will answer that question. We will see you in the next update.